Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hey, thanks for tuning in once again. I appreciate you guys making the time to be here. So, real quick before I begin reading today and in our topic, what you're looking at here is my playlist slash podcast now, because it turned into a podcast. The, the Real Slave Trade of America, Facts versus Myths, right? So this playlist, I do recommend any of you that have not watched these videos right here, part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then so on, and all the videos attached. We're going to be reading about the Lucayan Indians. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this one. Specifically, after hours, we're going to look at this one too, the Lucayan Indians. Okay. And so on. So you guys make sure to catch up on all the rest. Okay, we've done a lot. Yeah, we've done a lot. So you guys can see a lot of videos here in this playlist when we're talking about the real slave trade in the Americas. You can catch that on my main page where you see the playlist tab. You'll find this playlist called The Real Slave Trade of America. All right, so we're going to get into, again, something that we read a little bit before. All right. Okay, so we're going to get back into this article right here, very scholarly article. It's called Indian Harvest, the Rise of the Indigenous Slave Trade and Diaspora from Hispaniola to the Circum-Caribbean from 1492 to 1542 by Aaron Woodruff Stone. This is a dissertation submitted to the faculty of the Graduate School of Vanderbilt University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in History, a PhD in History, right? May 2014, Nashville, Tennessee, approved by all these other PhD scholars, right? So we're going to belly flop to a part of the book where we left off kind of last time. Continuing, it says here, Queen Isabella, the first legal impediments to the Indian slave trade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how she tried to help a little bit with the whole Indian slavery that's going on, but they didn't really follow the rules, man. Nobody really listened to her. It says, even as Colon and his fellow Europeans developed an Atlantic slave trade, all right, Colon and his fellow Europeans developed what? An Atlantic slave trade. And they weren't grabbing them from Africa, guys. Columbus and all these people were enslaving Indians. A real Atlantic slave trade, yeah, with Indians. Queen Isabella questioned the practice and its morality. In 1495, she had postponed the sale of the majority of the 500 Indians Colon shipped to Spain until conferring with scholars and theologians to determine whether or not they should be slaves. She also sought a more complete description as to how the Indians came to be slaves and why they were sent as captives to Spain. A full year later, no decisions had been reached, and while little documentation exists to determine the fate of most of these Indians, at least 50 were finally sold to Juan de Lescano to serve as galley slaves. Okay? Talking about American Indians, guys. All these politics going around, but they continue in their enslavement. It don't matter what the politics say or eventually decide. Another named Francisco was sold to the widow Inés Rodriguez in Seville for 3,000 maravedis by two Genoese mariners, Domenico de Castellon and Francisco Magdalena, in 1497. By 1500, the queen had come to a decision, perhaps after seeing the growing number of Taínos slaves arriving in the port of Andalusia. All these Taínos slaves, okay, not Africans, going into Europe the opposite way. Middle passage, right? You have to go through the Atlantic to get there. Declaring the Indians of the Americas to be free persons and subjects and vassals of the Spanish crown. As vassals to the crown, the laws of Spain extended to the Indians of the Caribbean and in theory prevented their abuse at the hands of the Spanish colonists. Isabella even went so far as to order the return of all surviving Indians that Colon had brought to Spain. By the summer of 1501, only 21 of the original 500 were still in the possession of tourists, and one of them was too sick to travel. The other 20 men and women would be accompanied by the first large contingent of Franciscan friars who journeyed to the Americas in 1502. In addition to the Indians already in Spain, Isabella also tried to protect the future for those in the colonies. In her 1501 instructions to the governor of Hispaniola, Nicolas de Ovando, she made it clear that while the Indians of the Caribbean were to serve the Spaniards, they were not in fact their slaves, but vassals of the crown. All right, they're not your slaves, but they are there for your services, literally a slave. little indentured servant, right? The Indians also had to be converted to Catholicism and be treated well, as our good subjects and vassals, and that none should be hurt or suffer any indignity. Ovando and the other colonists were to be especially respectful of the caciques, who would make sure that their subjects obeyed the crown orders. Nevertheless, there still existed two ways to obtain an indigenous slave legally. If he or she was already declared as a slave, and there existed proof of this status, or through just war. All right, so if their status, their parents, or anybody, oh, they're already slaves, too late. Oh, you can keep them then. Or through just war, right? So-called prisoners of war, captives that were supposed to be rebelling, but a lot of times they would just raid in towns, guys, and grabbing innocent people, innocent Indians, men, women, children, old people, and just making them slaves, saying they were fighting them. They would make up that story. That's why they put just wars here in parentheses. So Spaniards could still legally purchase or trade for pre-Columbian indigenous slaves in the Caribbean, as well as enslave any Indians captured during warfare. So basically, any Indian still was being enslaved, guys. That whole thing about Isabella helping them, that was just politics. They had other ways to go around that, and they were doing that massively still. For a time, it seemed as though Colon's dream of indiscriminate enslaving throughout the Caribbean, especially of Carib islands, was not to be. So Columbus' plans was indiscriminate enslavement of the Indians. That's where all the money was. Although Isabella's official royal policy did appear to slow down the Indian slave trade, it did not stop it entirely. For the 3 years that the enslavement of Indians was expressly forbidden, only 3 years, right, from June 1500 until August 1503, an illegal slave trade continued in the Caribbean. It still continued. In 1501, Gonzalo Gómez de Cervantes, the local judge or official of Jerez de la Frontera, accused Cristobal de Guerra of illegally capturing many Indians from the Pearl Islands of Cumana and Cuchina, the Pearl Islands. All right, enslaving Indians and bringing others there to die for pearls. While exploring Cumana and Cuchina, Guerra engaged in rescate, acquiring large amounts of pearls, Brazil wood, and Indian slaves, again, not Africans. The whole slave trade we don't know about, guys. He then went on to island of Bonaire, where he encountered some indigenous resistance. So when we start going into these personal accounts of all these Spaniards, you'll see who they were really enslaving. During his coastal raids, many Indians were killed, but he did manage to capture an undisclosed number. These Indians he transported first to Hispaniola. These are your supposed Africans, right? That they're replacing the local populations with, but it's actually other Indians and Black Europeans. And then on to Seville. So they were taken to Hispaniola and also to Europe, Seville, Cadiz, and Cordoba, all in Spain. As the Indian slave trade had recently been declared illegal, the crown ordered Guerra to provide the records of all the Indians he had sold. The individuals who purchased the slaves would then be found and returned their money. The Indians were to be entrusted to the major or comendador Lares, who was to return the Indians to their homelands as soon as possible. While the Indians were under the care of Lares, Guerra was to pay their expenses. He also had to pay a fine for his crime. While the destiny of most of Guerra's slaves remained unknown, 6 of them were located in Cordoba. They were the property of Pedro Hernandez de Cordoba, who relinquished the Indians directly to the corregidor Cervantes in Seville so that they could be returned to their native territory. Whether or not they survived to journey back to the Caribbean, or if the Spanish government ever fulfilled their promises to the Indians, are unknown, all right? They don't even know if they ever actually got sent back. It was all politics. Despite Guerra's punishment, slave raiding along the Pearl Islands, all right, and coast of Venezuela, not Africa, not West Africa, continued for several years, largely under Alonso de Ojeda. Indian slavery, okay? We continue, and it says here, expanding the legal Indian slave trade to the Lesser Antilles and Tierra Firme, 1503 to 1514. For a brief period, the enslavement of most of America's native peoples was illegal, all right, with perpetrators of the crime actively punished by the crown, at least if the Indians were transported to Spain. However, only 2 years after her initial decree, Isabella was already making exceptions to the ruling against the enslavement of the Indians of the Caribbean. The first Indians to suffer from her reversal were the Caribs of the Lesser Antilles. In 1503, it became legal to enslave all Caribs or other Indians who violently resisted Spanish governance and Catholic conversion. All right, so we've been reading about the St. Vincent Caribs, right, and the Lesser Antilles. Same people, right, in the 1500s getting enslaved all the way back. So it didn't start in the 1700s like we read the other day, or after that, where they're becoming the Garifuna, but it's been having been enslaved and possibly taken to Central America even in the 1500s. Before that, this change in legislation essentially opened Pandora's box, allowing for unscrupulous colonists and merchants to deem any unpacified Indian as a Carib. So anybody who wasn't, now they're just Caribs. As a result, many of the Arawak and Taíno people were labeled Caribs, along with other indigenous groups of the mainland, would be wrongly designated as Carib, accused of cannibalism, and carried off as slaves to Hispaniola. Okay? In 1503, Isabella designated the island of San Bernardo, Fuerte and Barra, the ports of Cartagena, the Venezuelan coastline, and anywhere where the cannibals are as Carib lands. Interestingly, and demonstrating the purely economic character of the designation, none of these lands corresponded with Colón and Cuneo's reports of cannibalism, all right? They were just making it up so they can enslave these people. Instead, the territories marked as Carib were those close to areas the Spanish believed to hold mineral wealth, all right? That's what they were doing. They were just saying that so they can remove the Indians so they can get the wealth, the mineral wealth. You see, between 1509 and 1512, the rest of the Lesser Antilles and much of Tierra Firme of the mainland were added to the list, right? That's where they got their blacks of the land, or Tierra Firme, the mainland, because they already exploiting the blacks of the Lesser Antilles and Caribbean. Then now they added them to the list. Now this is where they get into slaves. You guys paying attention? Any method used to capture the Carib slaves was legal, from rescate to extreme violence. Anything, any means necessary. From the sale of these slaves, the crown expected to receive a fifth of the profits, becoming openly involved in the slave trade and its revenue for the first time. Okay? We're talking about American Indians being enslaved, guys, not Africans. This is the whole history they leave out. They try to downplay and say, oh, it was very little. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't, guys. Wake up. The merchant Juan de la Cuza, that's his last name, de la Cuza, commanded one of the first assaults against the Caribs, attacked the island of Codego, located at the mouth of the port of Cartagena, in the summer of 1503. During the raid, Cuza captured 600 Carib Indians, many of whom were women and children. Wow. This is what I'm trying to say, guys. Like, when you're trying to go into the personal stories of these specific conquistadors, right, and colonists, and you start seeing their personal narratives and what they personally did, the records will tell you, each of them all enslaving American Indians. They're not going to Africa. Look, this guy alone and this one raid got 600 Carib Indians as slaves, most of them women and children, right? Literally creating slaves. These are the same people. They would be reclassified, paper genocide, eventually be sent to other places. Now they're just Negroes. So small slaving expeditions continued to capture Carib Indians from 1503 forward. But it was not until the massive depopulation of Hispaniola Taíno population that the slave trade will really explode. Okay? They're telling you right here, when they said they lost all those local workers in Hispaniola and they had to get more slaves, they didn't go to Africa like they try to tell us. This is when this really exploded. They were messing with the Caribs and other indigenous people of the Americas. This depopulation began in the campaigns against the rebellious Taíno caciques in the late 15th century, continuing apace into the early 16th century. Concurrent with the legalization of slave raids against Carib Indians was the renewal of the taking of Taínos in just war on the island of Española. While Isabella prohibited the enslavement of any peaceful Indians in the Americas, she also decreed that they should labor for the Spanish colonists in the construction of towns, extraction of gold, and production of food and other goods. They're still slaves. The Spanish were to arrange the labor with the island's caciques and pay every Indian a small salary. If the Indian refused to work, they could be forced to complete these tasks, but always as free men, not as slaves. This contradiction would soon become apparent. All right. That's not what really happened, though. All right. We continue. I hope you guys enjoying the reading. We got to know all these deep inside stories and history, right? And get all these people recorded, all the numbers added up, so you guys can see how massive this really was. I'm talking about all my slavery videos in the last 8 years of American Indians being enslaved. Continue, we have here, it says, Governor Ovando and renewed war against the Taínos of Hispaniola. When Governor Ovando arrived in Española in 1502, he faced almost immediate resistance in gathering the Taínos to labor for the Spanish in their settlements and mines. The first cacique to rise against the Spanish and their demands was Cotubanama, a lesser cacique of the Higüey Casco, located in the southeast corner of the island. First, many of the caciques of Higüey told the Spaniards that they could only pay a third of the tribute owed. During ensuing negotiations, a Spanish attack dog killed a lower cacique. To avenge his death, and likely to avoid paying any more tribute to Spaniards as well, all of the Taínos of Higüey rose up. Under the leadership of Cotubanama, the Indians killed 8 Spaniards on the island of Saona, a very small island just south of the province. Upon learning of the uprising, Ovando sent 400 to 500 Spanish soldiers to punish the cacique and his people. According to Los Casos, what followed was a massacre in which hundreds of Taínos perished of all sexes and ages. All right, we got this account already, right? Before. Cotubanama himself was hanged along with another 13 men. A massacre happened, guys. They killed a lot of the Taínos because of this. The Spaniards took many more as slaves. All right, not Africans, Taínos as slaves, before which they cut off one or both of the Taíno captives' hands and sold in the growing town of Santo Domingo, though some were sent to Spain. Each Spanish soldier led between 10 to 20 Indian slaves in chains. Okay, listen. Even the individual soldiers, the auxiliaries, again, a lot of these black Europeans auxiliaries they were using, remember, each of them had at least 20 to 20 Indian slaves in chains on the journey back to Santo Domingo. That's how many slaves they were capturing, guys, and not in Africa. If this accounting is accurate, a minimum of 4,000 slaves were taken from Higüey, just from that area alone in Hispaniola. 4,000 slaves just from that area alone from Higüey, the Higüey people, the Taínos of Higüey. Okay, guys? 4,000 just in this little period, this little town. All right, so again, this was massive, guys. This was happening all over the Americas for many years. I want you guys to understand that. You think I'm trying to say like, oh, there wasn't no slavery? Yes, there was. It's just the story's not being told correctly. Almost immediately following the attack on Higüey, Ovando led another expedition into the heretofore largely untouched Cacasco of Jaragua in the west of Española. While the cacique Vejecio had agreed to provide Bartolomé Colón with cotton in 1496, after his death, it is likely that his successor, Cacica Anacaona, all right, like it is, like Anacaona, which we read about already, failed to fulfill most of her tribute deliveries. Her actions could be explained by her alliance with the rebel Roldan, whose followers had found refuge in Jaragua for several years. Why would she pay tribute to the Spaniards at Santo Domingo when she believed herself to be under the protection of Roldan? Whether the lack of tribute or her alliance with Roldan sparked his actions, Ovando, along with 300 soldiers, marched into Jaragua in July of 1503, ostensibly to meet with Cacica. Even though Anacaona greeted the Spanish entourage with ceremony, welcomed them into Jaragua, Ovando responded with violence. At this point, Ovando did not have diplomacy in mind, and instead conducted a surprise attack on Anacaona and her peoples. Remember, he told her to gather all the chiefs in a tent, and then he burned them, right? During the massacre, Ovando set fire to Anacaona's royal house, killing 84 of her subject caciques. Despite her gender, Anacaona was hanged, demonstrating her status as paramount cacica. With this massacre, Ovando succeeded in neutralizing one of the most powerful indigenous rulers of the Caribbean. All right, this is sad, guys. This really happened. Remember this. Never forget what happened. As in Hugüey, the Spanish took many other Indians of lower status as slaves. Okay, not Africans. However, in Jaragua, many were able to escape, fleeing to Cuba and other nearby islands, or to the mountains of Bajoruco. Here again, we see the continuing significance of pre-Columbian inter-island connections. Years later, caciques of Hispaniola were still seeking refuge in Cuba. Notably, the cacique of Hatuey escaped to Cuba in 1511. Okay? The governor Diego Colón then justified the conquest of Cuba through the pursuit of a fugitive, Hatuey. So remember Hatuey, the story of Hatuey, guys. Remember they burned him alive and they gave him a chance to become a Christian before he died so his soul can go to heaven. He's like, well, are there Christians up there in heaven? They're like, yeah, many. Well, I don't want to go there then. I'd rather go to hell if there's these demon-like evil Christians up there. So it says later that year, Hatuey was captured by the Spanish and sentenced to death. According to Las Casas, Hatuey said that he would rather go to hell than live with the Christians in heaven. All right, like I just said, it's a famous story, guys. A real forgotten hero. All right, and we continue here, as it says here, the Encomienda System. Now, we've gone over this a lot, guys. This is literally another form of indentured servitude through land, through working through a land, to a plantation, connected to a plantation. So Encomienda System, by December of 1503, Ovando already realized, along with other Spanish colonists of the island, that the Taínos of Hispaniola were not going to willingly move from their ancestral lands to labor in the newly created Spanish towns. This realization brought about the creation of the very controversial Encomienda. This institution formally subjected America's native peoples to Spanish overlords, okay? Put them under a contract. The crown commanded a certain number of Indians living within certain boundaries or in a specific territory under one cacique to a single Spaniard known as an encomendero. That was the master. This encomendero will collect all tribute from his commended Indians, usually through the help of their natural lord or cacique, giving the crown their royal fief. In exchange for the tribute, the encomendero was in charge of ensuring that his Indians were converted to the Catholic faith and that they were treated well. So along with being literally treated like slaves, they had to convert to their Catholicism, right? The Indians serving in an encomienda, except the caciques and their families, were considered free and were known as naborias. This term comes directly from the Taíno word for commoner or worker. Naborias could not be sold nor inherited and were not considered property, unlike the Indian slaves taken from Carib lands, all right? It's all about status, right? Some were treated like chattels, some had contracts. In theory, then, an encomendero would provide his Indians with an education and legal protection as they worked with their cacique to gather tribute for the crown. In reality, the encomienda system worked quite differently, with few authorities actually monitoring the treatment of Indians by their encomenderos, at least until the outcries of religious figures like Las Casas and Montesinos. Abuse was endemic. In many cases, the lives of Hispaniola's naborias was only marginally different from that of an Indian or African slave. I told you it's the same thing. They're being treated the same, guys. It's all politics. And what African slave? Other people who are enslaved. Conditions only deteriorated further as the population of native Taínos fell, with encomenderos expecting the same amount of labor or tribute from fewer Indians. For example, if one cacique governed 200 Indians in 1 year and 50 died while laboring for their encomendero, the following year the encomendero would still expect the cacique to provide him with 200 workers, regardless of the diminishment of his peoples. All right, so they had to go on slave raiding expeditions to enslave other Indians, right? So they wouldn't be enslaved, so they can meet the quota. So it says here the consequences of disease, slavery, which I would say a larger part, war and famine, population decline, all right? The implementation of the Encomienda System in 1503 led to a precipitous decline in the native population of Hispaniola, a pattern that would be repeated throughout the Americas, all right? Basically, Indian enslavement is what caused the decline, not just disease. The decline in population can be explained by many factors, including wars, attacks like those of Santo Cerro and Higüey, and spread of diseases, famine, overwork, exhaustion in the island's gold mines, and suicide. While everyone agrees that Hispaniola and the larger Caribbean experienced a sharp decline in indigenous populations following the arrival of the Spanish, many argue over the actual numbers. Much controversy surrounds the pre-Columbian population estimates of the Caribbean, so it follows that the rate percentage of loss is also disputed. Because how do they know? How do we know they're giving us the right numbers? They could have got rid of millions more and turned them into Africans, right? Like, this is what I'm saying, guys. Like, or just they want to downplay the numbers. Oh, we didn't kill that many. There was only 5,000 people on this when there could have been 50,000, right? So they get away with not documenting 45,000 murders or enslavements or whatever, relocations. Okay, so again, that's why this is still disputed. So modern scholars have estimated the 1492 population of Hispaniola to have been anywhere from 60,000, the very lowest approximation, to nearly 8 million. The highest guess, we have read accounts, right? About millions of people being enslaved and murdered from these islands. Millions from Spanish accounts from those times. These numbers come from chroniclers, like I said, like La Casas, who claim that 3 million Indians perished or were enslaved between 1494 and 1508. Again, 3 million Indians alone before 1508, guys, before 1508 enslaved or perished. Then in Central America before 1552, 500,000. Like, guys, you see the numbers. This is what they downplayed, and they created this story that they took millions from Africa. Censuses conducted in the early 16th century, annual loss of lives, and efforts to establish the island's carrying capacity. While each estimate has its merits, some of the most reasonable approximations for the pre-Columbian population of Hispaniola are between 500,000 and 750,000, with an upper limit of 1 million. Even if we take the lowest number of 500,000, then the decline in population is catastrophic. By 1514, when a census conducted alongside the Repartimiento of Albuquerque counted only 26,000 indigenous people. Let's say they had 1 million, right? That's the highest they want to allow people. Imagine. That's genocide, guys. This was also after years of slave raiding across the Caribbean. Slave raiding where? Across the Caribbean, not Africa, making it unlikely that all these Indians were native Taínos of the island. So a lot of these 26,000 Indians that were still on the island, a lot of them weren't even Taínos that were locally from there. They had been probably other Indians that had been brought there. Okay, that's what they're telling you here. They're probably not even Taínos of the island. In many ways, the influx of foreign Indian slaves, not Africans, also helped to mask the decline of Taínos on Hispaniola. All right. And it says here, King Ferdinand, a proponent of Indian enslavement, 1508 to 1516, okay? As the Taíno population continued to fall, efforts to replenish the island's labor force increased with more and more expeditions setting sail for Carib lands. For example, in 1508, Diego de Nucuesa and Alonso de Ojeda received permission to engage in slave raiding against the Caramaray Indians, all right, near the Gulf of Cartagena, as in modern-day Colombia, right? And in the islands of Saint Bernarbe and Fuerte to sell in Hispaniola. Again, enslaving Indians all around the Caribbean and South America to what? So they can sell them in Hispaniola, replace the local population. That what they told us growing up, they were replacing all these people with Africans. But this is the truth right here, guys. And then remember, they got their Europeans that I'm not even talking about in this report. All the Europeans they're enslaving and bringing over as indentured servants or auxiliaries or whatever status. So they want to sell them in Hispaniola. For the sale of these Indians, the crown required 1/5 of the profits. However, if the men did not sell them, they could benefit from their labor free of taxation. In addition to the Indians they could take from Tierra Firme and the adjacent islands, the men also had license to capture up to 400 Indians from neighboring Carib islands. Come on now. So, along with what they could take from the lands they were in, they could also go to neighboring islands and take up to 400. They had permission, guys. This was a legal enslavement, a legal Atlantic slave trade, a real Atlantic slave trade. However, these Indians were not meant to be sold, but to be put to work in the crown's gold mines. By 1508, the depopulation of Hispaniola was already limiting the crown's profits significantly, guys. By 1508, come on, guys, that's come on, 15 years after Columbus and them came, they already depopulating Hispaniola significantly. Expansion of the Indian slave trade allowed the crown to profit from taxes, gold extraction, and other industries of the Caribbean. The expansion of Indian slave trade, not Africans. The crown's policy shift was quite pragmatic. After Isabella's death, King Ferdinand authorized the enslavement of Indians from all useless islands. Okay? Islas inútiles. Just enslave them all, he said. Just enslave them all. Unlike his wife Ferdinand, seemed to possess few, if any, qualms regarding the enslavement of America's native peoples. The Spanish also argued that these Indians would benefit from communication with Christians as they converted them to Catholicism, since these useless islands were filled with sinful Indian idolaters. Now they want to call you the savage devils. Although the Indians taken from the Lucayos were to be Naborias as well, not slaves like the Caribs, they were not afforded the same legal protection as the native commended Taíno Naborias. Instead, they were Naborias perpetuos, or perpetual Naborias, meaning they worked year-round and received no protection from a local cacique. I mean, they're still slaves, guys. And the Lucayans, remember, they were described as very dark complexion. Remember, they were used in Hispaniola, as they're saying here, and brought to South America to dive for pearls. Remember my pearl diving video, guys? How many Lucayos got enslaved for that? You know, they want to say, oh no, they didn't have that status. Yeah, they did. They were being treated the same. And as it says here, worked year-round and received no protection. Most were destined to labor in the crown-owned gold mines, especially the best laborers. Additionally, if they resisted the demands of their encomendero or relocation, they could be declared a slave and legally sold, which many were. This is what I'm saying. She got sources for this, guys. These sources we're going to go over individually. We got to get every case. That's what I'm saying. So you guys can start seeing how specific it gets, how many records actually exist of this, unlike the other false slave trade. The distance between Naborias and Indian slaves was shrinking rapidly by 1509. In September of 1509, the king sent orders to Ovando to capture and bring as many Indians from outside Hispaniola as possible. Capture as many Indians, not Africans, so they can refill Hispaniola. The demand for indigenous labor combined with the crown's new allowances sparked a huge rise in slaving expeditions in late 1509 into 1510. The exact number of voyages and how many Indians captured by each merchant, who's the merchant, remains unclear. The lack of records surrounding these missions can be explained by the fact that the slavers did not have to pay any taxes on their profits from Indian slaves. So the numbers we receive, guys, it could be a lot more in reality. There could be a lot more because a lot went unrecorded. Okay? Swept under the rug. Indian slavery. This is where you're missing all these millions of people you got to account for. There's all these slaves being brought up to the Americas and everything. This is the people right here. Perhaps this is because the profits were so slim, or that most raiders and merchants kept their captives to labor in their own encomiendas or gold mines. It is even difficult to ascertain which traders and raiders traveled to useless islands or Carib lands to capture their merchandise. However, estimates from various officials and chroniclers do exist for these years. In 1510 alone, approximately 760 Indians, whether slaves or Naborias, disembarked in the ports of Puerto de la Plata and Puerto Real on Española's northern coast. The influx of Lucayos Indians caused the native population on the island to rise by 8,000 Indians, despite an estimated net mortality rate of about 35% in the same year. Their numbers helped to mask the rapidly decreasing native population on the island, but only slightly. It is likely that only a small percentage of those captured actually survived the journey and their initial days on Hispaniola due to the slavers' treatment both during the capture and the return journey, all right? All the stories they said that happened to African slaves, it was happening to American Indians, guys. It was happening to Black Europeans too. Many died of hunger or wounds received from the Spanish enslavers before they even made it to the greater Antilles, all right? Misery before they even got there to their destination. One of the most prolific and active slave traders in the 1510s was Licenciado Lucas Vasquez de Leon. Man, we know Leon, man. We got a whole video on Leon. He was one of the biggest slave traders, huh? Active slave traders, right? He's the one who went to South Carolina. He brought up Indian slaves. They say he brought up Negroes. Do you guys understand? When they're saying that Lucas Vasquez de Leon went to South Carolina with like 100, 200 Negro slaves. This is before 1619, right? This is in the 1500s. So we already debunked the 1619 story with this voyage alone, right? Because they're saying he's bringing in Negroes, which were actually Carib or Arawak Indians, we found out, right, in our video. So this is more proof right here. They're letting you know this guy was a big Indian slave trader. A big Indian slave trader. If any slaves that he had, if he had any slaves, what I'm trying to say is they were most likely American Indian slaves, all right? He consistently failed to adequately provision his slaving expeditions, causing the starvation of many of his captives. That's Leon. Perhaps this was a successful strategy because each indigenous slave only sold for 4 pesos, at least in the early years. On one expedition, Leon and his cohorts, Pedro de Quejo and Francisco Gordillo, captured at least 900 Indians, guys. Listen, 900 Indians, these people alone. Again, when you go each case individual, all these conquistadors, all these colonists, all these Spanish, all these crypto Jews, all these merchants, all these pirates, you start seeing all these Huguenots, all these Spartans, and you start seeing who they really enslaving and how many. The numbers keep adding and adding and adding up in the last 8 years. So these guys alone, 900 Indians, half of whom died in pens in the Lucayos while awaiting on additional ship for their voyage to Española, where they would be sold. They also used those same people even to bring them up to South Carolina, as I was saying earlier. At this point, the Spaniards viewed the supply of Indians in the Caribbean islands as practically inexhaustible, unlimited for them. Eventually, this would change as the numbers of Indians continued to fall across the Americas, causing their prices value to rise. For the Lucayos, Indians who did survive the journey, it is possible that the transition to life on Española was not too difficult due to the widespread kin linkages throughout the islands, especially the greater Antilles. The Lucayos Indians were likely able to assimilate to life with the Taínos of Española. In fact, despite the huge number of Lucayos brought to Española in 1510, alone, Spanish officials reported that the Indians of Española quickly incorporated the Lucayos into their society as if they were already one people. You guys hear that? Because they say that most likely Lucayos were like Arawak, like also kind of like Arawak Taíno people, like related to the Taínos. So that's why they assimilated very well. There was a lot of them brought over there as slaves, guys, a lot of them. Yeah, not Africans. They said that we were already one people. Prior to 1511, almost all Lucayan Indians were also declared Naborias, a label that carried some legal protection. This would not be the case for Indians coming from more distant territories like the coast of Venezuela, Mexico, or Florida, Seminoles, Yamassees, all the other ones. What's the ones that we've gone over before? You know, all these different tribes, the different names in Florida that existed, right? The Temuqua, the Ayis, and all the rest. It says the increased importation of foreign Indians, the increased importation of foreign Indians, not Africans, accelerated the native caciques' loss of authority, affecting their relationship with both Spaniards and Indians. Unlike the Taíno Indians and those living within the Taíno cultural sphere, who possessed loyalties to, or at least familiarity with Española's caciques, the newly arriving Indians from places such as Florida and Tierra Firme would have felt no allegiance to the resident caciques. This is especially true since they were lifelong slaves of the Spanish encomenderos. Simultaneously, the increase in Indian slaves began to influence how the Spaniards themselves viewed Española's indigenous peoples. In fact, by 1512, Spaniards used the word Naboria to refer to all Indian laborers on the island, no longer distinguishing between the elite natives and their subject workers. These imported Indians were even branded on their legs, all right, branded on their legs, just like they say they did to the Africans, right? But they were doing that to the Indians. Listen, branded on their legs to distinguish their status. This is the first mention of the branding of Indian slaves, a practice that would continue into the climax of the Indian slave trade across the Caribbean. Okay? The Indian slave trade across the Caribbean. After years of unrestrained slave raiding, come on, after many years, guys, this is not just 1 month, 1 week, 1 day, one little town, one person. After years of all these people enslaving Indians unrestrained, at least by 1520, the Lucayos Islands were literally depopulated. They got all enslaved. The Lucayos, there goes your Africans. Las Casas estimated up to 40,000 Lucayo Indians were sold. 40,000 guys were sold in Hispaniola. In Hispaniola alone. What about the ones that went somewhere else? What about the ones that got sent to Virginia, to South Carolina, to Central America, to South America? Pearl diving, remember? So 40,000 Indians from the Lucayos people in Hispaniola during the height of the trade in Indians from useless islands. How many more Indians died during the process is unknown, as are the fates of these Indian slaves, many of which were sent on to the Pearl Islands. After 1514, we got the whole drop. We got every part of this story. When they were taken, where they started, where they ended up in Hispaniola, then from there, where they went, Venezuela and the Pearl Islands, and what happened to them there, and some of them ended up in Barbados as the first slaves. Come on now. We got the whole backstories, guys. That's why I like to read these little inside stories so you can understand. In these latter years of the slave raiding, the value of Lucayos Indians soared as the Spanish recognized their ability to dive for pearls, all right? We connect in so many videos, so much research we have. Get the context. Got to remember this happened, guys. It wasn't Africans. They told us growing up that it was all Africans doing all this stuff and pearl diving and all this other stuff. It was the American Indians they were using. Their price rose up to between 50 and 150 pesos. This increase in profit from Lucayos Indians led to even more slave raids of the islands. Despite their dwindling numbers, eventually these raids would lead to the discovery of present-day Florida and South Carolina. Perhaps because of this valuable skill, these Indian slaves were treated better, with records indicating the survival of Lucayos Indians in the pearl fisheries of Cubagua and Margarita as late as 1527. Okay, we got the drop. We got the drop, guys. Remember, Indians, local Indians here were doing that for thousands of years, and then they brought some Lucayos who were really good at it too, diving for pearls, which in history they told us it was Africans that they were doing that with. But now look how openly they're admitting this was all the Indians doing this. Concurrent with the exploitation of the useless islands was an expansion of the list of territories declared as Carib lands. In 1511, the crown legalized war on the Caribs of Dominica, Martinique, Santa Lucia, San Vicente, La Ascensión, Los Barbados, Tobago, Mayo, and Trinidad. Essentially, the royal order labeled most of the inhabitants of the Lesser Antilles as Caribs. So again, remember, being labeled Carib or a useless island, automatically they got put on that status where they can be enslaved. Legalizing their capture, transportation to, and enslavement in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. A lot of these people ended up in Puerto Rico. A lot of you Puerto Ricans are these people. They don't even know. They think they're just from Puerto Rico alone. Per a royal order issued in July of 1511, all Caribs introduced as slaves to Hispaniola and Puerto Rico had to be branded as slaves on either their legs or arms, causing a little pain as possible. And make sure it's painful, they said. Damn, that's so messed up. All right, again, she has sources. They have sources for all this stuff. We have the records. This is what I'm saying, guys. Though the brand would continue to change, the earliest model was that of F for King Ferdinand. Interestingly, while merchants had to pay the royal fifth on all sales of individuals from useless islands, they did not have to pay any taxes on the profits from the Carib Indians. Okay, now remember that eventually that symbol F, the brand first then became C for Charles or Carlos, Charles V, a black man. All right, Ferdinand was a black man too. He was branding other black folks, Indians. It wasn't based on complexion back then. So it's even better than enslaved Carib, so-called labeled Carib, because now they don't have to pay taxes. By 1511, the Indian slave trade was on the rise, now encompassing much of both the Greater and Lesser Antilles. However, some key islands were still exempt from slave raiding, including Guadalupe and Santa Cruz, sites of burgeoning crown colonies since 1508. This would change by the end of 1511. And we have here the Rebellion of Agueybana. In the late summer of 1510, up to 30 caciques of the island of Puerto Rico met secretly to plot a rebellion against the recently arrived Spaniards. Despite warnings of danger, the encomendero Cristobal de Sotomayor journeyed to the cacique Agueybana's II territory, where he demanded guides and translators to accompany him to explore the island's central mountain range. Though the cacique initially agreed to Sotomayor's demands, upon his departure from Agueybana's cacicazgo, Agueybana and a small squadron attacked Sotomayor and his men during the assault. The Indians killed the encomendero and his 4 companions. Next, Agueybana and 3,000 Indians attacked and burned down the newly established town of Aguada, killing even more Spaniards. All right, so they went back at them hard in Puerto Rico. This was the beginning of a general uprising that would not be settled for several years. According to the officials and chroniclers of the time, the Caribs from the neighboring islands of Santa Cruz and Guadalupe helped the Taínos of Puerto Rico in their uprising. These Caribs could have been from the nearby islands, or they could have been those recently brought to Puerto Rico as slaves by Sotomayor from Dominica and other Lesser Antilles. By 1513, there is concrete evidence that a coalition of Taínos from Puerto Rico with Indian Caribs from the Leeward Islands worked together to burn the northern settlement of Capara, killing 18 Spaniards. Taínos from Puerto Rico also sought refuge in Santa Cruz, Guadalupe, and as far south as Trinidad throughout the conflict. Here we see some of the best evidence of pre-Columbian ties between Taínos and Caribs, surviving into the colonial era. Agueybana's rebellion prompted the Spanish government in Hispaniola to issue a royal order at the end of 1511 declaring general war on all Caribs and their immediate enslavement. Okay, their immediate enslavement, not Africans, Caribs. Right, we learned about black Caribs yesterday, right? And relocation to Hispaniola or other islands with mines. All Caribs taken during these expeditions would be slaves. Additionally, no taxes had to be paid on any profits for the sale of Caribs. This was the first decree to legally associate Caribs with cannibalism. All right, associate. It wasn't true. By the summer of 1512, 2 large armadas were organized to punish the Caribs and engage in rescate for slaves and pearls in Dominica and the Virgin Islands. Okay, for slaves, again, all American Indians, not Africans. You see this history they leave out on these sources she got, which we're going to verify individually. All the Indians captured on these ventures were taken to Santo Domingo, branded and registered. Afterwards, they were divided up between La Vega and San Juan de la Maguana and Buenaventura to labor in the island's mines and budding sugar mines, okay? They became slaves in Hispaniola, all these Indians. This is the ones that were replenishing the island because the local population had gone down. They told us growing up, guys, again, I can't emphasize this enough. They kept telling us all our lives growing up, learning about the slave trade, that they were replacing all these local Indians with Africans. And it's not true. Many thousands, hundreds of thousands of American Indians were brought to Hispaniola as slaves too from other parts of the Americas. Still, it was not until 1514 that the King of Spain went beyond authorizing enslaving expedition across the Caribbean to order an armada to attack the Caribes living in Trinidad, Dominica, Santa Lucia, Barbados, and San Vincent or San Vicente, specifically to capture slaves to sell on Hispaniola, specifically to replenish Hispaniola, right? Not West Africa. They ain't going to West Africa. It's right there. In response to this ruling, many private expeditions set out to conquer and raid the Carib islands of the Lesser Antilles, okay? Because of this authorization, the Dominican friars claimed that 40 islands belonging to the Lucayos chain, as well as 3 more populated by the giants, present-day Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, were completely stripped of inhabitants. Completely stripped of inhabitants. They were enslaved. Who they're enslaving? Despite their initial population estimates of over 50,000. These were completely stripped. We know minimum 50,000 people become slaves, and then they get turned into Negroes and Africans in history to us. Okay, you guys see? This is the history they don't teach us in schools and universities. Nobody talks about. Everybody kind of sugarcoats or marginalizes. It says most of the giant Indians, these giant Indians, tall Indians transported to Hispaniola died within a few months, many from eating a poisonous fruit. The officials of the island explained the high attrition rate to the giants' unfamiliarity with the island and their suffering from homesickness. That's what they blamed it on. Apparently, these same problems did not affect the Carib or Lucayos slaves, leading the judges and officials to Española to promote their capture over the giants. Look how they're calling these Indians the giants. So there's a little table here, says enslaver Juan de la Cuza, and then multiple, then Gaspar de Espinosa and the other multiple. So it says 1503, 600. Him alone. 1510, you got 25,000. They left out a lot of names here. Lucayos, huh? It says Gaspar de Espinosa had unknown numbers. They don't want to say how many. Then multiple 55, per islands. They had a lot more than this, guys. This table is really, this is just a little graph somebody made up. The requirement further legitimates slave taking through just war. Fake just wars. They're saying they're taking prisoners of war that were rebelling, but a lot of the time they were just enslaving innocent people. They will go on these slave raids on these towns, these American indigenous towns, right, over the night or whatever, burn them all and take everybody as slaves or prisoners. And then they've called these just wars. Perhaps to give these large and small slaving armadas the facade of legality, or in response to the first complaints by religious officials concerned with the well-being of America's indigenous peoples, the Crown instituted a new practice in 1514, the reading of the requerimiento or requirement. So again, this was a declaration they used to make before they enslaved the American Indians. They would pull out this paper and read it in front of them and say, hey, we're here to enslave you, or unless you bow down to us, give us your land, and submit to the Holy Roman, whatever, king, empire, whatever. And they wouldn't even know the language. If they, they wouldn't obviously say yes, they would get enslaved. It says this document required the indigenous people of the New World to submit religiously and politically to the Crown of Spain and the Catholic Church, like I just said. They literally did that, guys. They thought that would make it okay. We warned them before warring on the Indians or enslaving them. That's what they would read out to them. The Spanish soldiers had to read the requirement publicly, giving the native residents an opportunity to submit peacefully to the new religion and authority. That's how silly this was. Like, they're going to really do that. If the Indians failed to submit or refused to accept Christianity, they could legally be attacked by the Spanish soldiers and enslaved. All right, that made it legal. Understand how they deal with their conscious and legalities back at home. However, the requirement, as with many other laws and policies, did little to change the actions of Spaniards on the ground. Not only was it usually read to indigenous populations who could not understand the speech, but the Spanish often read the requirement from on board their ship or in the middle of the night to an audience of trees and empty huts. All right, see, it's all a game. With the new requirement in hand, ship after ship set out to attack the Caribs, engage in rescate in the Pearl Islands of the coast of Tierra Firme, and to collect all Indians living on useless islands. All of them, guys. Listen, this is where they're getting their slave populations. Pedrarias Davila was the first Spaniard to use the requirement in an expedition to Santa Marta in 1514. Because the Indians did not respond peacefully and favorably to the requirement, they were reduced to slavery. Okay? Slavery. American Indians, not Africans. All right, another guy, Pedrarias Davila. Keep keeping track. By 1515, for the first time, the Circum-Caribbean witnessed a full-scale Indian slave trade, okay? Full-scale Indian slave trade. Within only 3 months, at least 4 armadas left from Puerto Rico, sailing for Guadalupe, Santa Cruz, and other Carib islands to capture slaves. Where are they going? To Guadalupe and Santa Cruz and Carib islands to capture slaves, not to Africa. All right? Not to Africa. Two led or sponsored by Juan Ponce de Leon. Others were captained by Juan Gil and Juan Bono, both residents of Puerto Rico. That led by Bono sailed to Trinidad, where he captured 180 Carib slaves, just this guy alone. In 1516, at least 8 armadas assaulted the Pearl Islands, all sailing from the 2 main ports of Puerto Rico, San Juan and San Germán, capturing slaves and engaging in rescate for pearls. Only 2 of these armadas recorded the number of slaves taken, one returning with 15 Indians from Cariaco and other with 40 Indians from an unknown territory. So they didn't really record it. They kept it on the hush. Again, where they taking all their slaves from, guys? This is what I'm saying. Beyond the areas where the Spanish could legally engage in slave raiding, merchants also traveled to Central America and to present-day Florida, as the need for Indian laborers inspired missions of exploration. In 1515, Gaspar de Espinosa captured many slaves from the province of Comogre in Panama. Espinosa was not alone. Shortly after his expedition, the Bishop Juan de Quevedo of the Panamanian province of Darien complained to the crown about the harmful effects of taking slaves from Panama. All right, again, from Panama, not Africa. According to Quevedo, the slavers were not only depopulating his lands, but causing all the Indians of the region to mistrust all Spaniards, running away from them on sight. Thus, the slave trade was preventing the conversion of these Indians to Catholicism, despite the fact that they were not Caribs. Okay, they weren't even Caribs, but they got labeled so. Okay, where are they going? All the way through the Caribbean, all over Central America and South America, guys. This is where they were getting their slaves, guys. I hope that, when you watch this whole playlist that I mentioned earlier, the real slave trade that I got you, not just the what says part, 1, 2, 3, but even the ones attached to the playlist, they deal with slavery. Check out all these videos, guys, so you guys can see. There's a whole other story that you can actually verify other than what they told us growing up. This is big. They left this out. They didn't teach us how large this really was, how large scale, all these slaves, they were really grabbing from these places right here, guys. In the complaints of Quevedo, we see just some of the arguments against the slave trade and its impacts on the native peoples of the Caribbean. It would be the calls of religious and some secular officials that would bring about concerted efforts to reform both the Indian slave trade and the general treatment of America's indigenous peoples. However, despite efforts by the crown and various religious orders, the Indian slave trade would only grow, especially as more and more Taínos perished in the first smallpox epidemic of 1518. Even as Indians fought their enslavement in numerous rebellions, The Spanish colonists sought the capture of more and more Indian slaves across the Circum-Caribbean to supplement the deteriorating labor force on Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. This is what they were supplementing and replenishing it. I told you. And they told us it was Africans. Look, they're grabbing everybody in the Caribbean, all these Indian nations in all the Caribbean islands and South America, right? Bringing them to Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The growing slave trade will bring about increased exploration into new lands and ultimately the full commodification of America's Indians. All right. And that's where we're going to leave it off today, guys, with this article, because it goes on to chapter 3 after that. So we read all chapter 2 completely. All right. I just wanted to go ahead and emphasize again, how big this really was. And so you guys can have a clear understanding, the full context of American slavery. Again, this was the article written, Indian Harvest, the Rise of the Indigenous Slave Trade and Diaspora from Hispaniola to the Circum-Caribbean, 1492-1542 by Aaron Woodruff Stone. Dissertation submitted to the faculty of the Graduate School of Vanderbilt University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor in Philosophy in History. All right, May 2014. Shout out to Aaron Woodruff for the great research. All right, hopefully, he definitely got his PhD after this. But thank you for tuning in, guys, and listening to me read more, add more to this research on the real slave trade of the Americas. I hope the numbers are already by now very convincing as who they were really enslaving. We're, again, leaving out all the Europeans they brought over, which we'll definitely get back into more and more again. But this is also the story that we can't forget, the indigenous slave trade and diaspora. All right. If you're new to my channel, please catch up on the older videos and work your way up. Thank you to anybody who's donated or supports in any way, like my Patreons or channel members. Appreciate you guys, my longtime followers, and my channel moderators. Thank you for all the love. Thank you for staying all the way to the end and reading this with me today. Appreciate you guys making time to do that. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow.